In this video we'll be analyzing a small little problem with a Spitfire that it's got an interesting issue. It's a common issue. Basically the engine stalls out while it's idling and you step on the clutch. No surprises, most people knows the reason for this. Usually it's a case of the thrust bearings wearing thin and the engine or the crankshaft pushing up against the internals of the motor and binding up and seizing. Normally a very common fix on this issue. Basically just pull the sampan off, replace it to thrust bearings, put the motor back together and send the car on its way. Normally. Sit back, relax, and let's dive into this one. Okay, so here we've got a Triumph Spitfire Mark III. Bit of an interesting situation on this one. Idles fine, runs fine, but as soon as you depress the clutch, the engine tightens up and stalls out. So a little bit of a weird one. We've got a suspicion as to what it is. We're gonna lower down the sump, drain well, lower the sump, and have a look if our theory is correct. Okay, so the engine sump is off, as you can see, and you have to jerry rig the motor up in the front to get the sampan to clear the bell housing on the gearbox to get it out. Okay, so here we have the three main bearing shells from the Spitfire motor. So this one would be the frontmost bearing, closest to the radiator. This is a middle bearing right in the front of the motor, or in the middle of the motor, and then this is the rear bearing, which is closest to the flywheel. You might notice that this one is slightly thicker than the other two, and the reason for that is this bearing also locates the thrust bearings. Okay, now that is what a thrust bearing looks like. So this thrust bearing is bigger than the Spitfires. This is thrust bearings for a Triumph GT6. Principle is the same. So what happens is the thrust bearing sits effectively around the top side of the bearing, so inside the engine block, and you'll have one bearing sitting this side, and you'll have one bearing sitting this side. Yes, there is rust on it. It is a old thrust bearing. Okay, so what the reason for the thrust bearing is it basically centralizes the crank inside the motor. So the thrust bearing ensures that the crank can't move too far forward or too far backward. That forward backwards motion, that's got to do with pressure from the clutch. So if you want to think about it in a different term, every time that you step on the clutch, you're putting a huge amount of pressure against the crankshaft, and obviously that pressure needs to go somewhere, and that pressure is going to move forward. So your crankshaft will then have the tendency to push forward into the engine. Now the thrust bearing on this side prevents the crankshaft from moving too far forward. If the thrust bearing fails, what happens is, on a Spitfire you normally get a condition where the crankshaft starts rubbing up against this bearing shaft or bearing cap, and that then automatically fails the motor or stalls the motor. Like I said, it's a pretty common issue on a Spitfire as well as the 6-cylinder Triumph engines, that these bearings fail prematurely. Just as a note for the novice builder, there is a friction and a non-friction side to these bearings. So if you look at this bearing, has got two grooves in it. Those are oil journals. So basically what that means is your engine block doesn't rotate, that stands still. So the non-oiled side will be against the block. The friction side, which is the side designed to take friction from the crankshaft, will be lubricated through those journals. So always remember to check the journal and make sure that it's facing the right way. Friction side towards the crank face. Rule of thumb. You can turn it around. It's not a good idea. It won't last. It's going to fail. Better to use that side. So don't do it. Okay, so what went wrong with our Spitfire? So if you look at this bearing face, you'll see that it looks like it's machined here, and that is wrong. It's not supposed to look like that. That bearing shell is supposed to look like that one. There's no machining on it, it's just a flat face. So if I turn this bearing around, you will see that there's score marks on the side of the bearing as well. The crank was running up against the bearing shell. The same if we turn the number 1 bearing shell over, right way around over, you will see that there's score marks on this bearing shell as well. And that's where the crank pushed up against the bearing cap too hard. So what would cause that? Like I said, worn thrust bearings. In this case, the thrust bearing was not at fault. And if the thrust bearing is not at fault, what would have caused that? Well, if you take one of those things, when you build a motor, you look at where it goes and you decide not need it. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So whoever the genius was that built this motor decided that thrust bearings was completely optional. And we end up with a situation where we've got a very badly damaged crank, we've got a very badly damaged bearing caps, and as a result we've also got a very, very unhappy customer. Is it fixable? Yes, it is. Let's move over into the next slide where I actually can show you on the crank the damage and what we have. Okay, so if you look in that area there, see if the camera will show it, you can actually see how the inside of the crank has been eaten away by the block and the bearing cap, which is a pity, because everything else on the motor was really, really nice. The crank, I think, is pretty decent. It probably just needs a good polish. I would suggest, and I have suggested to the customer that we look at replacing main and big end bearings. I did a compression test prior to pulling the motor apart, and compression and cylinder leak was absolutely brilliant, close to a brand new motor. So I'm very reluctant to go that far into the motor. Depending on what the situation is with the block, I might have to pull the motor apart, but I'm going to try my very, very best as to limit how much we do to the upper side of the block. Okay, so since I shot that segment around the crankshaft, I've actually had a look at the block. There's some slight scoring, but nothing that's going to affect the way the thrust bearing fits or works. So I'm actually not bothered with the cylinder block. I'm happy with how it looks. I think it's good enough. I don't foresee any issues. It's fine. I'm not even going to bother with it any much more than that. So in that regard, cylinder block is fine. I am a bit concerned about the bearing cap, specifically the number 3 bearing cap closest to the flywheel. That is a bit machined. Fortunately though, like I said, there's no friction face there. It's once the bearing cap is in and you've got your thrust washers in like you're supposed to, the crankshaft will never ride up against it unless there's a serious catastrophic failure on the thrust bearings. So that one's a bit iffy. I'll have a look at it, see what we can do there, make a decision from there. But in any case, so for now, the next step will be to go to the engineering shop, and then once we get the engineering shop, or once we get back from the engineering shop and we've got the crank back, then we'll do a part 2 on this video. So yeah, unfortunately this is going to be a multi-part video. Okay, so that will be the end of this one. Like I said, unfortunately it didn't pan out like we did. As you can see, I think it's time for me to go heat the shower and try and make myself a little bit more presentable, although it's not really that easy. But in any case, so thank you for watching. Please remember to hit the subscribe button. I hope I'm on the right side. And leave a comment. And we do try and answer all our comments. So yeah, leave us a comment and we'll respond to it. Thanks for watching. Cheers.